Snow fell like an endless curtain of white silk, weaving silence across the ridges of northern Arizona. The world was frozen, as if holding its breath, and within that stillness a cabin stood alone, its wooden frame scarred by storms, its windows shuttered against the biting wind. Inside lived a man who had long since turned away from the world. John, a soldier once, a husband once, a father once, now a solitary figure who carried grief like a second skin. His days were measured by the swing of an axe, the weight of firewood, the slow rhythm of survival. The fire crackled, steady and warm, but it did not chase away the shadows in his eyes. He had chosen this silence. He thought it would keep him safe from remembering, from longing, from the ache of everything he had lost. Yet fate often arrives when least expected, carried on trembling footsteps. That night, as the snow deepened and the wind whispered against the shutters, John heard something that did not belong to the wilderness, a soft, uneven crunch in the drifts, hesitant, fragile, but undeniably human. He stilled, breath caught in his chest, and turned toward the sound. Through the storm's pale veil, a figure appeared. A woman, stumbling barefoot, her torn dress flapping against her legs, her skin burning against the cruel cold, her hair hung in a thick braid, her face drawn with exhaustion, eyes wide not with anger but with desperate hope. She sank to her knees just steps from his porch, her body trembling, her voice a rasp carried by the wind. "Please," she whispered, "let me in." John's first instinct was caution. He had lived too long with the knowledge that mercy could be a trap. His hand tightened around the axe still warm from his grip, and his gaze swept the trees for danger. But the storm revealed no shadows, no hidden movement, only her, a soul caught between life and death. Her lips cracked as she tried again. "I can reward you, please." Shame flickered across her face, as if the act of begging cut deeper than the cold. In that moment, John saw not an enemy, not a stranger, but the raw truth of someone who had been cast out, left to freeze, yet still clung to the will to live. Against the voice of his own solitude, he stepped forward. He carried her inside, her weight far lighter than it should have been, her silence heavy with unspoken pain. The fire's glow embraced them both, wrapping the cabin in warmth and the faint fragrance of pine smoke. He laid her gently on a rug, wrapped her in wool, and pressed a mug of salted honey water into her shaking hands. She did not speak. She did not thank him. But her eyes, dark and guarded, lingered on him with the fragile trust of someone who had nothing left to lose. In that silence, something shifted. Not yet comfort, not yet love, but the first spark of a story neither of them had expected. Outside, the snow thickened, hiding the world beneath white, erasing all paths of return. Inside, two lives had collided in the heart of winter. It was not fate dressed in grandeur, but a quiet, healing collision. Two wounded souls meeting in the storm, carrying the weight of the past, yet unknowingly stepping into a future where warmth might return. This was not the end of John's solitude, nor the end of her exile, but the beginning of something that would test them, heal them, and perhaps even teach them to love again. And as you follow this journey, let the warmth of their story settle gently into your heart. If you find pieces of yourself reflected in their silence, in their longing, in their fragile hope, I invite you to stay close. Like the fire that kept them alive, your presence here keeps this story burning. If these words touch you, let them be known. Share a thought in the comments. Let your voice join the quiet. And if you wish for more stories woven with love, healing, and the timeless pull of fate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every gesture, as small as it may seem, becomes part of this circle of warmth we create together. And now, as the storm rages on, let us step deeper into their tale, where silence and survival will slowly give way to something neither John nor Tala dared to dream of. The fire glowed with a steady hum, shadows swaying along the cabin walls as John sat nearby, his broad frame hunched but steady, watching the fragile rise and fall of her breath. The storm outside clawed at the world, but here within the log walls, warmth wrapped around her trembling form like a fragile promise of life. He didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it. Silence, for now, was the safest language between two strangers who had lost too much. She sipped carefully from the tin cup, her hands shaking, but each swallow seemed to draw her back from the edge of the frozen abyss. Her eyes followed the flame, glassy, half-lidded, yet within them there was something deeper than fear, something like shame, something like the quiet ache of someone who had been judged and abandoned. John moved with quiet precision, laying another quilt beside her, his rough hands practiced in tending wounds, though his heart had long since stopped tending his own. He wrapped her feet gently, rubbing warmth into stiff skin, his mind circling with questions he didn't speak. Who was she? Why alone? Why barefoot in the cruelest storm? He told himself not to care, to only keep her alive until morning, then send her back into whatever path she came from. Yet even as the thought brushed his mind, he knew he would not follow it through. Something about the way her body leaned, not in weakness, but in exhausted dignity, held him there. Hours passed, the night settling thick and white beyond the shuttered windows. She drifted into a shallow sleep, curled near the hearth, her lips murmuring fragments in a language John did not know. He listened, his breath steady, the sound strange yet soft, like a prayer woven into the crackle of firewood. At one point her eyelids fluttered open, and her voice rasped against the stillness. 2 days, she whispered, her throat raw. No boots. Taken. The words were broken, but the meaning struck him harder than the cold ever could. She had walked barefoot in the snow, cast out, stripped of even the smallest chance to survive. By who? He asked, low, steady, though part of him already knew. My people, she breathed, and then her voice fell silent again, as if the weight of those words had emptied what little strength she had left. John stared into the fire, his jaw tight. He had seen cruelty before, men cutting each other down in war, neighbors turning their backs in famine. But this, to leave a woman to freeze because she could not give what was demanded of her, cut against something deep in him. He did not press her further. He only rose, ladled beans into a bowl, tore a thick piece of bread, and set it in her hands when she stirred again. She ate slowly, each bite deliberate, as if she had been taught to never waste, as if food was more than sustenance. It was dignity. When she finished, her gaze lingered on the fire again, the glow painting her face in shades of sorrow and strength. Later, as the hours stretched into midnight, John sat at the table, his rifle above him on the wall, his solitude reshaped by the presence of a stranger who no longer seemed like an intruder. She shifted under the blanket, her eyes watching him now, not with suspicion, but with the weary acceptance of someone who had nothing left to lose. At last she spoke again, her voice faint but steady. "Tala." It was not an offering, it was a truth, a piece of herself laid gently into the quiet. John met her gaze, his reply just as simple. John. No promises, no explanations, only names, as if that was all either of them could bear to share in this moment. The night deepened. Tala leaned against the hearth, her breathing steadier now, her strength faint but returning. She watched him as he stoked the fire, his movements careful, precise, the way of a man who had built survival into ritual. She said nothing, yet the silence between them no longer felt jagged. It settled into something else, fragile, healing, a quiet rhythm born of necessity. John unfolded a cot near the stove, gesturing to it without words. She stood, swaying, but walked on her own, her body still aching yet determined. As she lay down, she glanced at him once more. "You're alone too." It was not a question, only an observation. John gave the smallest nod. 8 years. No explanation followed. None was needed. The storm howled again, pressing against the walls, but inside the quiet held firm. For the first time in years, John did not eat in solitude. For the first time since her exile, Tala did not brace herself against the cold. Between them, something unspoken had begun. Not yet love, not yet trust, but the first fragile thread of survival woven together. And as the snow buried the world outside, they lay in silence, no longer strangers entirely, but two lives caught at the edge of winter, unknowingly stepping toward the warmth of something neither had dared to hope for. The morning would bring more frost, more work, more questions. But for now, as the fire burned low and the cabin held its breath, the quiet was no longer empty. It was alive, carrying them both into the unknown, two souls who had lost everything, yet perhaps, just perhaps, had begun to find each other. Morning crept into the valley beneath a pale sky, its light softened by the heavy curtain of snow still clinging to the ridges. John had risen before the dawn, his boots crunching through the drifts as he cleared a path to the barn, breath curling in thick clouds before vanishing into the silence. The work was steady, almost meditative, shoveling, scattering straw for the cows, checking the roof beams for strain, but his thoughts circled back to the figure inside his cabin. When he returned, he found her sitting at the table, wrapped in his quilt, her face calmer, though still shadowed with the residue of cold and exile. The fire painted her skin in warm tones, and for a fleeting moment John felt as though the cabin had shifted, as though it no longer belonged to solitude alone. She rose carefully, testing her weight on feet still raw from the snow. Her limp was sharp, each step an echo of pain, but she did not falter. She braced herself against the stove, attempting to ladle beans into a bowl, her jaw set with quiet resolve. John stepped forward, his tone even but firm. "You should have waited." She didn't look at him at first, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the pot. "I'm not helpless." Her voice was steady, neither defiant nor weak, only filled with the stubborn dignity of someone who refused to be broken. John said nothing more, only reached past her to steady the pot, moving with quiet assurance, his presence more protective than controlling. Their shoulders brushed, and though neither stepped back, both felt the unspoken current, humming in the silence. They ate together again, the clatter of spoons and the crackle of the fire filling the spaces words could not. At one point, John asked, his eyes lingering on her face, "Where were you trying to go?" She paused, chewing slowly, before answering with a stillness that chilled him more than the snow. "I wasn't." His brow furrowed. "Then why?" She looked at him directly, her gaze sharp despite exhaustion. "I wasn't supposed to live." The words hung heavy in the air, sinking into the wood, into the silence between them. John's hand tightened around the tin cup, anger stirring, not at her, but at the cruelty that had cast her out to die. He did not reply with pity. Instead, he said firmly, "You don't strike me as someone who gives up." Her lips parted, her voice quieter now. "I didn't want to die, but I accepted it." The admission did not break her. It steadied her, like a truth finally spoken into light. John cleared the bowls, setting them into the wash basin, his movements carrying a weight that words could not. When he returned, his voice carried a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "You can stay here, as long as you need. I have room." Tala's eyes lingered on him, searching, weighing the honesty of his words. He didn't flinch, didn't soften the offer with false comfort. He meant it, and she knew. She gave a small, nearly imperceptible nod, and though she didn't speak, something inside her eased, like a knot untangling after too many years of silence. That afternoon, she asked him for a knife. His eyes narrowed, caution flickering, until she explained, her hand brushing the frayed braid down her back. "It's tangled and dirty. I don't want to carry the past on my back." John hesitated only a moment before handing her his small utility blade. She took it with reverence, sat before the fire, and cut through the braid with steady hands. When it fell onto the floor, black strands curling against the wood, her face softened, freer somehow, as if she had laid down a burden she no longer needed. John didn't watch, but when he saw her later, with her hair trimmed short, her shoulders straighter, he understood the quiet strength in that act. Evenings unfolded gently after that. She helped peel potatoes while he salted meat, her hands slow but skilled, the rhythm of work easing the silence between them. She did not ask about the photographs turned face down on the shelf, and he did not ask about the ceremonies she had once been part of. Yet the air was no longer heavy with suspicion. It began to breathe. One night, her voice broke the quiet as she sat near the fire, her face half lit by the glow. "Your wife, did she die here?" John's jaw tightened, but he answered plainly, "No. Fever. Down in town. My boy, too." Tala bowed her head slightly. "And you stayed?" His gaze met hers, steady but shadowed. There wasn't anything worth staying for down there anymore. The silence that followed was not hollow. It was understood. Two lives broken in different ways, yet mirrored in loss. She looked at him with eyes that no longer saw a stranger, and her voice softened. "You're not like most men." He did not answer, but the truth of it hung in the air between them. That night, for the first time since her arrival, she slept without her body tensed against fear. John watched her for a moment before settling into his own cot, the fire low, the storm pressing softly against the walls. The quiet was no longer the same as before. It was not cold, not empty. It was a beginning, fragile, healing, alive. Outside, the snow still held the world hostage, but inside something had begun to thaw. Two souls bound not by ceremony or expectation, but by survival and the slow, unspoken recognition of each other. And as dawn prepared to rise again over the silent ridges, their story was already shifting, pulling them toward a place neither had imagined, a place where healing might finally take root in the frozen earth. The days unfolded in a rhythm neither had expected. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, a relentless reminder of the world outside. Yet inside, warmth grew in quiet layers, stitched together by small gestures. Tala no longer spent her hours only wrapped in silence. She began to move through the space with a steadier step, her limp softening as the pain in her feet lessened. John noticed it without comment, the way she fetched kindling, folded blankets, or carefully stirred a pot on the stove, her hands moving with a grace born of resilience. She had been taught to survive, to endure. But now, in the flicker of firelight, he saw something returning to her: choice. In the evenings, when the work was done and the storm hushed into a low moan beyond the shutters, their conversations deepened, not in abundance, but in weight. One night, her gaze lingered on the fire before she spoke. "I wasn't barren," she said, her voice even, but edged with years of swallowed pain. John set down his cup, listening without interruption. "He was older than my father, chosen for ceremony, not for love. When there was no child, he let them believe it was me. He cast me out so they would not doubt his strength." Her eyes lowered, but there was no shame left in her voice, only truth. John leaned forward, his voice low, steady as the logs settling in the hearth. "You knew." She nodded once. "There was a boy before, years ago, when I was still young. We kept it secret. I lost that child too early for anyone to know. But I knew I could bear life. I never doubted." The fire snapped, filling the silence that followed. She did not look at him, but her hands, resting in her lap, stilled as though she had laid down a weight she had carried alone for far too long. John's reply was simple, spoken with quiet conviction. "Then it was never you." Her eyes lifted then, meeting his, and for a moment something flickered there, relief, fragile but real, as if his acknowledgement had loosened chains the years had forged around her heart. She whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." It was the first time she had said it, not in exchange for survival, but in recognition of being seen, wholly, and without judgment. After that night, subtle changes grew between them. He found her by the basin, washing her hair with melted snow water, her shortened braid clean and shining in the firelight, her posture taller. She no longer seemed like a ghost cast adrift in the storm, but a woman claiming herself again. John, too, shifted in ways he had not expected. He brought her small things without announcement: a bar of soap wrapped in cloth, a pair of wool socks, his late wife's patched coat. When he set these down, he did not speak, and she did not ask why. She only accepted them with a nod, her hands lingering a moment too long over the coat, as if she understood the weight of what it meant to be given something that had once belonged to another love. In the mornings, the air between them felt lighter. Tala woke before him sometimes, tending the stove, wiping the table, moving with quiet grace, as though she had always belonged to this space. John noticed the way she handled each object, not as if she were borrowing, but as if she respected its history, never taking more than she was given. It reminded him of his wife, but it did not hurt. Instead, it soothed, like a healing balm pressed over scars that had ached for years. One afternoon, while they worked on mending a broken hinge, Tala asked him softly, "Do you still go to town?" He nodded, wiping the iron clean. "Every few weeks, depending on the weather." She tilted her head, curiosity threading her voice. "People there know you?" He shrugged lightly. "They know I keep to myself." She did not ask to go, did not speak of returning to her tribe. Her questions carried no yearning to escape, only a quiet wondering, as if she had begun to imagine a life beyond the exile she had been given. Later that same day, John climbed into the loft above the barn and brought down old lumber, weathered boards that had once waited for a project he never began. He laid them out in the snow, measuring, aligning, his breath steady in the cold air. Tala stood on the porch, wrapped in his flannel shirt, watching him with a look that was not suspicion, but recognition. "You meant it," she said finally. "About building something." John met her eyes without hesitation. "I don't say things I don't mean." She stepped down into the snow, joining him, her hands brushing against his as he handed her a hammer. Together they began framing a small extension onto the cabin. It was not grand, not meant for ceremony, but strong and simple, built from his hands and guided by her presence. Each board hammered into place was more than wood. It was permanence, the quiet foundation of a life neither had expected. She learned quickly, her fingers raw but determined, her face set with a strength that made him look at her differently. Not as a guest, not as someone to be pitied, but as someone who was choosing to stay. That night, when the fire burned low, John placed his mother's old keepsakes on the table, a plain silver ring, a small wooden carving of a pine tree. He told her of his mother's words before the war, "Keep this until you find someone who stays." Tala traced the carving with her fingers, her eyes shining in the firelight. "I have already chosen you," she said, her voice steady, filled with a warmth that wrapped around him like a second fire. He leaned closer, touched her face with a gentleness he hadn't known he still carried, and kissed her, slow, unhurried, not born of urgency, but of recognition. From that night forward, they no longer walked separately through the cabin. When their hands touched, neither pulled away. When their eyes met, there was no turning aside. It was not sudden, not dramatic. It was a healing unfolding, like spring beneath the stubborn snow, steady and certain. And as the storm outside began to ease, leaving the sky pale and heavy with thaw, the bond between them grew, fragile yet unbreakable, carrying them toward a future neither had dared to believe could exist. The silence that had once been John's shield was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence, her quiet strength, her choice to stay. And Tala, who had been left with nothing but shame and exile, now found herself not merely surviving, but belonging, as if the frozen ground itself had offered her roots at last. Together they sat by the fire, their breaths mingling with the soft glow, and though no words were spoken, the truth was clear. This was no longer his cabin alone. It was theirs. And from this place, a new chapter would begin. The snow had begun to ease, though the cold still pressed in, heavy and sharp, as if the mountains themselves wanted to test the strength of those who dared survive upon their slopes. Yet within the cabin, change had taken root, subtle but undeniable. Tala no longer sat silent in the shadows. She moved with purpose now, her steps careful but steady, her hands no longer trembling when they worked beside his. She folded blankets with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial, wiped down the table as though tending something sacred, and each morning rose with a quiet determination that reminded John of the life he had once known, the rhythm of a home not bound only by survival, but touched by belonging. One afternoon, as he split logs behind the cabin, he turned to find her standing at the doorway, wrapped in the patched coat he had given her. Her hair, once heavy and burdened, now cut short and braided clean, brushed lightly against her shoulders. She held herself straighter, not as a guest, not as an exile, but as a woman stepping into her own place. For a moment, John simply looked at her, the axe loose in his grip, and realized that the silence he had once cherished now felt richer because it was shared. When evening came, she helped prepare the stew, her hands deft, her movements graceful. They ate together at the small wooden table, and this time the silence between them was no longer guarded. She asked about the garden he had kept in warmer months, about the cows in the barn, about the patterns of the snow when spring finally arrived. He answered in his plain, steady way, surprised at how easily her voice filled the cabin, how naturally her presence shaped itself around his routines. She did not pry into his grief, and he did not press into her wounds, yet, little by little, the walls they had built around their hearts softened. That night, after she set down her spoon and leaned back against the chair, she looked at him with a gaze both steady and searching. "Do you miss her?" she asked, her voice soft, carrying no judgment. John's hand stilled over his cup, and for a long moment he let the question settle. Finally, he spoke, his tone low but certain. "I did, for a long time. She was kind. But after the baby, after the fever, it was too much to carry. That's why I came here. I didn't want reminders." Tala's eyes did not turn away. She nodded slowly, not with pity, but with understanding. "And now?" she asked gently. John's gaze shifted to her, and he breathed out as though laying down a burden he had carried alone. "Now it doesn't feel like I'm running anymore." The fire crackled softly, wrapping their silence in warmth. She brushed her hand lightly over the edge of the blanket draped across her lap, then whispered, "You let me in, not just through the door." He rose, crossed the room, and crouched beside her, his hand steady as it touched her jaw with quiet reverence. She did not flinch. Instead, she leaned slightly toward him. And when he kissed her, it was not a kiss born of hunger or need. It was steady, healing, a recognition of everything they had endured and everything they had chosen. That night, they lay in the same bed for the first time. Tala slipped beneath the quilt without hesitation, her bare feet brushing against his. John held her close, not to claim her, but to protect, to honor the choice she had made to stay. Their bodies moved together slowly, with no urgency, no ceremony, only the unspoken truth of two souls finding solace in one another. The firelight painted the walls in gold, and when it was over, they did not speak. They did not need to. In the dark, her whisper came soft, carrying both strength and fragility. If I carry a child this time, it will not belong to anyone but me. John pressed his lips against her hair, his voice quiet but sure. It will belong to both of us, and no one else. Outside the snow fell again, soft and endless, but inside the cabin neither of them felt the cold. For the first time in years, John's arms held more than memory, and for the first time since exile, Tala's body rested without fear. The days that followed carried a different rhythm. Tala rose before him often, rekindling the stove, moving about the cabin as though she had always lived there. She no longer reached for the blanket with desperation, but moved freely, her presence weaving itself into every corner of the room. John watched her without saying much, but in his chest, something long dormant had begun to stir. Hope. It was in the way she folded his shirts beside her flannel, in the way she brushed her hair at night with calm, steady strokes, in the way her eyes no longer drifted to the door as though expecting to be cast out again. One morning, as he returned from the barn, she was seated at the table, staring at her hands with a quiet intensity. He asked her gently, "What is it?" She hesitated, then lifted her gaze. "It's been weeks. I haven't bled." John froze, his breath caught in his chest. She held his gaze, not smiling, not asking, only waiting for truth. "You're sure?" he asked. She nodded once. "I know it wasn't me." He sat beside her, his expression steady, his voice soft but certain. "Then we plan for that together." Her fingers gripped his hand tightly, and for the first time since the storm had brought her to his door, her eyes shimmered not with fear, but with a fragile light of hope. "If it's true," she whispered, "if it grows, I want this child to live like we do. Not in fear, not under someone's name. Just here, with you, with me." John's hand closed around hers, his voice like an oath. "Then that's what we'll do." That evening, as the fire glowed and snow dripped from the roof, Tala began stitching scraps of fabric into small, careful shapes. John reinforced the walls of the new room, his hands steady, each nail a silent promise. They did not speak of names, did not speak of futures far away, but their movements spoke louder than words. The cabin no longer held only survival. It held the fragile beginning of a family, born not of ceremony, not of demand, but of choice, of love, and of the quiet healing that comes when two broken souls dare to build something together. And as spring whispered faintly through the ridges, still distant but inevitable, they prepared, not just for thaw, but for life. A life neither had expected, yet both had begun to embrace as their own. The thaw came slowly, as if the mountain wished to test their patience before surrendering to spring. Icicles clung stubbornly to the eaves, dripping in the weak light of midday, while the snow in shaded hollows lingered, pressed into silence. Yet inside the cabin, warmth bloomed with a quiet constancy. Tala's belly had begun to change. Not yet a swell that would draw eyes from a distance, but enough that her hand drifted unconsciously to her stomach when she moved, as if her body already recognized the life within. John noticed without pointing it out. He simply shifted his labor to carry more of the weight, stacked firewood closer to the door, laid extra straw in the barn, and made sure the hearth never burned low. The cabin no longer felt like the refuge of a solitary man. It bore the softness of her presence, folded fabrics at the edge of the table, herbs hanging to dry above the stove, small stitches gathering on scraps of cloth in a basket she kept by her chair. She moved slower now, her steps careful, but her eyes were calmer, her voice surer. In the mornings she would sit near the window, watching the meltwater trickle beneath the pines, and John, returning from the barn, would find her with that faint expression that was neither sorrow nor joy, but something in between. Peace. One evening, as the fire burned steady, she stood within the small room he had built onto the cabin. The floor still smelled of sawdust, the joints newly tightened against the cold. It was plain, with one cot, a chest, and a small table. Yet her eyes lingered on the walls, as though they carried more meaning than the stones of her old lodge ever had. John leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching her in the dim light. "I can fix a shelf here if you want," he said, pointing to the bare wall. She turned slowly, her voice quiet but firm. "You built this for me. I won't ask for more." He shook his head lightly. "You don't have to ask. You live here now." The words fell simply, without ceremony, but they struck deeper than vows. Tala's gaze softened, and for the first time the corners of her lips lifted into a smile, small, restrained, but genuine. It was not the smile of someone who had been given something, but the smile of someone who had chosen and been chosen in return. As the days grew longer, they prepared together for what lay ahead. John set traps along the ridge and showed Tala how to mend the lines. She learned quickly, her fingers strong despite their scars, her movements sure. At night she stitched small garments from scraps of flannel, the needle glinting in the firelight. John would oil the hinges of his tools while watching her, his chest tightening not with grief, as it once had, but with something steadier, something that healed without demanding. One afternoon, as they walked down to the hollow where the snow thinned, Tala paused by the old stump where they had left her letter. In its place lay a strip of woven cloth, deep red, the thread of ceremony. She picked it up, her hands trembling slightly, her breath caught between past and present. "She got it," she whispered, her voice breaking softly. John's brow furrowed. "Is it a good sign?" Tala nodded slowly, pressing the cloth to her chest. "It means I am remembered. I am no longer ghosted." Relief passed through her like sunlight breaking through the storm, and John, watching her face, felt something in his own chest ease, as though he had witnessed not only her survival, but her return to life. That evening she leaned against him as they stood over the fire, stirring stew. "You always have me," she murmured, her voice steady, her body relaxed into his. He rested his hand against her side, his eyes fixed on the flame. "And you always have me." The seasons turned gently. Birds returned to the ridge, filling the mornings with song, and the ground softened beneath their boots. The cabin, once a place of exile, now breathed with life. Tala's steps slowed further as the weight in her belly grew, but her eyes never dimmed. She carried herself with a strength that was not forced, but natural, born of knowing she was no longer alone. John's days were filled with work, yet every task, chopping wood, mending fences, salting venison, carried the quiet undercurrent of purpose. He was no longer keeping himself alive. He was keeping them alive. One night, as the firelight traced gentle shadows across the walls, Tala took his hand and guided it over her stomach. Beneath his palm, a small movement stirred, not just a flutter, but the undeniable push of new life. His breath caught, his hand steady, his eyes fixed on hers. She whispered, her voice low but filled with quiet wonder, "This child will be born into stillness, not ceremony, not fear." John tightened his hold around her fingers, his voice carrying a vow, born into choice. She closed her eyes then, her face softening as though the last of winter had melted within her. For the first time since the snow had driven her barefoot to his door, she rested fully, not bracing against the night, but welcoming it. The storm that had once threatened to consume them had passed, and now, as spring stretched its fragile hand across the mountains, they stood together. Two souls who had carried grief like a second skin, now shedding it piece by piece, healing in the warmth they had built, and waiting for the life that would soon join them. The cabin no longer belonged to solitude or to exile. It belonged to them, and to the future pressing quietly, insistently, into the rhythm of their days. And with each breath, each small moment, they stepped further into that future, side by side, unafraid of the cold that once ruled their lives. By mid-April, the last stubborn crusts of snow had melted from the lower trails, leaving the earth soft beneath their boots, damp with the memory of winter. The ridges sang again, birds chasing one another in bright arcs, squirrels darting from branch to branch, streams running clear and restless through the valleys. The air was still sharp in the mornings, but by noon it carried a gentler warmth, a promise that life would flourish once more. Inside the cabin, that same renewal pulsed in every corner. The rooms no longer bore the stillness of morning, but the steady hum of a home being lived in. Tala's basket of mending sat beside John's tools, her stitches careful and even. His shirts dried on the line beside the flannel she had claimed as her own. The new room, once plain and unfinished, now carried colour. The soft tones she painted with plant dyes, the shelf he had built for her, the wooden carving his mother once gave him resting on it as though it had always belonged there. Tala moved slower now, her belly round and firm beneath the fabric wrapped around her waist, yet there was grace in her pace. She paused more often, her hand drifting instinctively to her stomach, her breaths deeper as the child shifted within. She did not complain, never once spoke of pain, but John noticed the way her shoulders eased when she rested by the open window, the way her eyes softened when the wind carried the scent of thawing earth. He brought her basins of warm water for her feet, laid extra quilts by the bed without needing to be asked. She accepted these gestures with quiet gratitude, not because she expected them, but because she knew each one carried the weight of his care. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, they walked together to the ridge above the basin. From there, the valley spread wide, glistening with the shimmer of meltwater. John pointed out the new bloom near the creek, tender shoots stretching toward the light. Tala bent to pick a sprig of wild mint, crushing it between her fingers, the scent rising sharp and fresh. She smiled then, not the guarded smile of someone testing the ground, but an open one, radiant and unrestrained. John stood beside her, silent, yet in his chest something swelled, something that had not stirred in him for nearly a decade. On the way back, they stopped by the stump where her letter had once been left. In its place rested a strip of woven cloth, deep red, the thread of her old lodge's ceremony. She picked it up with both hands, her eyes closing briefly as though listening to something carried in the fibers. "She got it," she whispered, her voice breaking with relief. John's eyes lingered on her. "Your mother?" She nodded, her throat tight. "It means I am no longer forgotten. I am remembered." He said nothing more, only rested his hand against her back as they walked home in silence. Yet within that silence there was no emptiness. It was full of healing, of forgiveness, of a wound finally beginning to close. That evening, as Tala prepared the last of the winter carrots for stew, she pressed a hand to her ribs, pausing as the child shifted hard against her. John rose quickly, moving to her side, his hand steadying her waist. "I've got you," he said, voice low but sure. She leaned into him, her breath easing, her lips curving faintly. "You always do." Later, when the dishes were washed and the fire burned low, she led him quietly to their bed, her hand slipping into his, her gaze filled with a calm certainty. In the dark, her whisper brushed against him. "You never asked me if I wanted to marry you." John turned to her, his eyes searching hers, steady as the earth. "I thought I didn't need to. We already chose each other." She smiled then, softer, warmer. "Still ask me?" He did not hesitate. "Will you be my wife?" She nodded once, her voice a vow. "I already am." The child shifted again, and John's hand pressed over her belly, firm and reverent. "Our child," he murmured. She covered his hand with her own, whispering, "Our family." The next weeks unfurled with a gentleness that felt like a gift. The buds on the trees burst into leaves, hens clucked fat and loud in the yard, and the cabin, once a shelter for grief and exile, stood alive with the rhythm of a family. Tala moved carefully, her steps slower with the weight she carried, but her spirit was light, her eyes no longer shadowed. John worked steadily, tending the land, reinforcing walls, preparing for the season ahead. But now every stroke of the axe, every nail driven into wood, was not for survival alone. It was for her, for the child, for the life they were building together. At night, when they lay beneath the quilt, the fire fading into embers, Tala would rest her head against his chest, her breath even, her hand always drifting back to the swell of her stomach. John would hold her close, his eyes tracing the ceiling beams, his heart steady in a way it had not been in years. Neither spoke of destiny or fate. They did not need to. What they had was quieter, stronger, a bond woven not from ceremony, but from choice, not from demand, but from love. And as spring deepened, carrying the promise of new life, they knew the cabin was no longer merely a refuge from the cold. It was a home, rooted, alive, waiting to welcome the child who would be born not into exile, but into belonging. And though the mountains still held their silence, inside the walls of that cabin, a new story had begun, one of healing, of love, of two souls who had chosen each other and found, against all odds, the warmth they thought they had lost forever. The valley unfurled in green, the pines whispering with wind that no longer carried the bite of winter, but the tender warmth of spring. Streams ran clear, rushing down from the high ridges, their sound filling the air like laughter after too long a silence. The cabin, once an island of solitude pressed deep into snow, had transformed into a home that breathed with life, with memory, with hope. Inside, the hearth glowed not only with fire, but with presence. Tala moving gracefully through the rooms, her belly round and full with the promise of a new beginning. John steady at her side, every task of his hands carrying the quiet vow of care. The new room he had built for her was no longer plain wood. Tala had brushed the walls with colour from crushed bark and plant dyes, soft earth tones that sang of belonging. On the small shelf rested the carved pine his mother once gave him, not as an artifact of grief, but as a marker of continuity, something old that had survived to bless something new. Every stitch Tala made, every pot of stew she stirred, every herb she laid to dry above the window, carried with it a rhythm that turned the cabin into a sanctuary. This place, which had once known only loss, now held the warmth of healing, the certainty of a future chosen, not forced. When Tala stood at the window in the evenings, watching the sun dip low across the basin, John would stand beside her, his hand resting lightly against her back, his silence speaking louder than words. She leaned into him, not as someone rescued, but as someone equal, someone who had chosen to share her strength as much as her vulnerability. Their nights were woven with quiet tenderness, with whispers of dreams, with the slow and steady recognition that they had built something together no storm could undo. As her time drew near, John found himself waking often at night, his hand resting gently on the curve of her belly, feeling the quiet movements beneath her skin. Each stir, each shift, reminded him not of fear, but of renewal. For years, the weight of death had been his only companion. His wife lost to fever, his child taken by winter's cruelty. But now, life stirred again, fragile yet fierce, within the woman who had come to him barefoot in the snow. He no longer feared the past repeating itself. He trusted in the strength of her body, the resilience in her eyes, the way she met each morning not with dread, but with peace. One evening, as the fire burned low, Tala placed his hand firmly against her stomach, her voice soft but unwavering. This child will not belong to titles or expectations. This child will belong only to us. John's eyes held hers, and his voice carried a gravity that wrapped around them both. Our child, our family. That is enough. Her lips curved into a small, radiant smile, and in that moment the cabin felt larger than walls, larger than the mountains. It felt like a world of its own, bound by love, strengthened by loss, alive with healing. The day came when the sky itself seemed to open, sunlight spilling across the ridges, birds singing without restraint, the earth soft and ready. Tala's body carried its rhythm, her breath deep and steady as John held her close, his voice calm, his hands steady. Hours stretched like an eternity, yet within them lay the raw miracle of survival turned to renewal. And when the cries of new life rose within the cabin, echoing against the wood and stone, John's heart tightened with a fierce joy he had not believed he would ever feel again. Tala held their child against her chest, her hair damp, her eyes shimmering with a strength that could not be named. "Alive," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Here, ours." John touched the child's small hand, his own calloused fingers trembling, his voice breaking as he whispered back, "Home." For the first time in years, he did not feel the emptiness of what had been taken. He felt only the fullness of what had been given, what they had chosen, what they had built with patience, with fire, with love. Seasons turned, and the cabin grew alive with laughter, soft at first, then stronger, weaving itself into every corner. Tala's voice sang lullabies in the quiet hours of night, John's arms strong and gentle as he cradled the child by the fire. Work still needed to be done, wood still had to be split, cows tended, fields prepared, but now every act carried a sweetness, a purpose beyond survival. Life was no longer about enduring the storm, but about embracing the light that followed. And so their story did not end with exile, nor with grief, nor with silence. It began again, in the warmth of a home forged by choice, in the gentle healing of love discovered when all else had been stripped away, in the soft weight of a child born into belonging. John and Tala stood together at the threshold of seasons, their hearts no longer haunted but whole, their lives no longer solitary but entwined. If this story has touched something within you, let it remind you of the quiet strength found in resilience, the healing that grows from love, and the hope that waits even in the coldest of winters. And if it warmed your heart the way their fire warmed theirs, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, to like and to subscribe, so that this circle of warmth, of healing, and of stories that remind us of love's power may continue to grow, carrying light into every soul that listens.